Hello and welcome to another edition of Hot Topic. This week I'm talking to Nick Dakin, Labour Member of Parliament for Scunthorpe. Nick, thank you very much for coming in. First thing to ask you, I think, has to be the big story in your constituency. Can you give us a quick report on what's going on with the steel industry?
Well, the headline is quite good news, really, that on the 1st of June, after all the difficulties we'd had at the end of 2015 and into 2016, Greybull Capital took over the Tata Long Products division, which is headquartered in Scunthorpe, with assets in the northeast and in northern France, and relaunched that as British Steel, a pretty totemic brand. And things have been going quite well. The business is turning a surplus at the moment, which is very positive. But we still are in a very challenging world for steel. And it does mean that the government still needs to do things around energy prices, procurement policy, business costs. And that's what we continue to do as steel MPs, working with the trade unions and steel makers to get that as it needs to be.
Just go through a couple of details within that. The energy prices, it's largely the taxation on energy, isn't it, that's putting that up so high. So that really is just something that the Chancellor of the Exchequer could sort out with a swirl of his pen.
Yeah, it's very much down to the additional costs in energy that are put on through various taxes in the UK and applied to high energy users like steel, compared with, for example, the German approach, which is to support their industry in a different way in relation to energy costs. So it does mean that we are less competitive, and energy costs is probably the second biggest element in making steel after labour. So it's a very important part of the cost base.
There is still the sort of systemic problem that the cost of steel is depressed, artificially perhaps, by Chinese dumping of steel in the world market.
Well, thanks to the European Union, there have been more robust use of trade defence instruments to stop the flow of Chinese steel into Europe. The British government was slow in respect of that, but after pressure from steel MPs and steel unions and steel makers, they have upped their game on that respect. But, so the pressures that the European Union are now taking has stemmed the flow of a lot of that cheaper Chinese steel imports, which of course were coming at being produced with not the same labour protections in China, and also produced at a higher carbon cost to the world, because the globe doesn't recognise that the carbon produced in China is any less dangerous to the world than carbon produced in the UK.
Those circumstances are still the same: the cost of energy, the local taxation, the competition from China. What is it that the newly named British Steel is doing that the Tata ownership couldn't do?
Well, I think it's a smaller outfit. It's still a very large business, but it's more locally driven. So the management is more able to be fleet of foot in the way in which they do things. And I think when you have a change in business leadership, it does give an opportunity for the new owners of the business to have a look at the business with fresh eyes. So some of the larger overheads that you get in a very large multinational corporation like Tata, they are no longer there, and I think that gives an opportunity.
And whose fresh eyes will they be now that Cyrus Mistry has removed himself?
Well, in terms of Tata, it's an interesting story. As you say, Cyrus Mistry has been removed, and Ratan Tata has taken more leadership there, and there is a new chief executive just announced the other week for Tata internationally, which means in relation to Port Talbot, which is the strip business in the UK. It'd be very interesting to see whether that results in more positive news for Port Talbot. I hope it does. I saw Speciality Steels based in Rotherham last week. Liberty Steel were signed a sort of heads of term in terms of taking over the ownership of that. So you have the steel landscape changing, with rather than one large steel maker and various smaller ones in the UK, you've now got a number of significant steel makers. So Tata remains in Port Talbot, British Steel headquartered on Scunthorpe, Liberty Steel in Scotland, and most likely now in Rotherham too. So you've got Liberty, British Steel, Tata.
One more on steel. British Steel, the name of the operation, based in Scunthorpe and in saving Scunthorpe in so many ways, a totemic name, as you suggested, but the old British Steel was a nationalised, state-owned industry. As a Labour MP, do you not hanker for those days? This is a private company running and saving Scunthorpe now.
I think it's important to look forward. I think what we need is appropriate government intervention on things like procurement. Frankly, for a Conservative government to be buying the steel for British Trident submarines from France is an outrage when it could have been made at the same sort of cost through UK steel, probably rolled in Scunthorpe. So I think the interventions that are appropriate today are things like making sure the procurement policies are right, making sure energy policies are right, making sure policies around business taxes are right, and giving the right support for the research and development we might need to make sure that steel remains an innovative industry of the future, not just an industry of the past.
Well, that leads me into another point I was going to make, talking about infrastructure investment especially. We hear much of the Northern Powerhouse, although the great advocate of the Northern Powerhouse is no longer in office as the Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne. We have your neighbour as an MP, Andrew Percy, as the Minister of the Northern Powerhouse. Right. How's that going to help Scunthorpe? How's that going to help anything on the south bank of the Humber and a little bit, off to the right of the core northern cluster of cities?
Well, I think that's a good question, and it's a question we keep asking. And I think it's good news that Andrew Percy has got a role in government which is significant. It helps us make sure that there is a voice around the table, hopefully batting for us. And certainly myself and my colleagues cross-party keep reminding Andrew of that, and he's happy to be reminded. But we need to see practical delivery for our part of the country, and really that's around, our big unique selling point is the Humber estuary, so about the energy estuary, around renewables, also around making sure that those gas-fired stations that we have, such as mine in Glanford Brig or the one on the Humber Bank, are still performing effectively to contribute to our energy mix. So there's a lot that can be done to support our area, and our job is to battle for that.
But it's really, the whole idea seems to just be a sort of transport infrastructure and roads and railways, for which Scunthorpe, or the Scunthorpe steel industry, is already well enough served, is it not?
Well, no, it can be better. I mean, if we look at the rail link between here in Grimsby, Cleethorpes, across to Doncaster, across to Manchester, that could be much improved. I think most rail travellers would agree with that. It would be nice if we had a rail link more direct to London, which is what we as local MPs have been arguing for. It was good to have my journey from Scunthorpe to Grimsby disrupted as I passed the work that's going on for improving the A180 up to the Humber Bank. But wouldn't it be nice to have an improvement to the A15 so that there's a proper north-south route which picks up the bypass around Lincoln and across to Newark as an alternative to the motorway route? That's what we need. And the A15 is a road in our area which has a lot more potential to be a more effective transport network.
You're not being very London-centric here. I know you have to commute every week to Westminster, but north-south connections, that's all very well. But the idea is that the north itself might be a discrete economic unit. It's the east-west connections that really matter.
And that's why I started with the east-west connections from Manchester to Grimsby on the railway, which is the railway needs upgrading in that respect, and very much so. And of course we've got the City of Culture in Hull in 2017, and if you want to find disrupted road networks, go to Hull at the moment. And we need to see much better connection. The fact that the government has said the electrification of the line to Hull will stop Welsh around Selby is actually a demonstration of a lack of commitment to our area, and we need to see that.
The new modern trains that are going to be running that's mean that the electrification is redundant, and
that's the story.
Technology has overtaken the electricity.
That's the story if you swallow it. But let's wait and see. What we need is efficient, effective, more modern connections, east-west as well as north-south.
You did mention Brexit a moment ago in relation to the steel industry and trying to make a defence from the Chinese imports. How does Brexit affect Scunthorpe more generally than that?
Well, of course, voters in the Scunthorpe area voted 2-1 to leave. So it's clear to me that people living locally believe that being outside the European Union is a positive thing. So the challenge to myself is, how do we make sure that we deliver the general feeling that I get from people, which is they want to come out, but they don't want to lose out. So, you know, the farmer who says, I want to come out of the EU, but I still want access to freedom of movement because I need that seasonal labour when I need it. The entrepreneur who says,
I'm going to have to stop you there, Nick. I like the coming up and not losing out. We'll develop that a little bit more in the second half.
Thank you.
Please join us again in a couple of minutes. Welcome back. I'm still talking to Nick Dakin, Labour Member of Parliament for Scunthorpe. Nick, sorry, before we were interrupted, we were just starting to talk about Brexit and the impact it might have on Scunthorpe, but you did point out that it was a 2-1 vote in your constituency in favour of coming out of the European Union. You were in favour of staying in the European Union. How representatives do you still feel of the people of Scunthorpe?
Well, absolutely. The people of Scunthorpe, thank them very much, elected me to represent them. That's my job, and that's what they expect me to do. And they expect me to take on board the vote that they've just had in relation to the European Union, and I very much do that. But also they expect me to make sense of the messages I'm getting, you know, from the farmer who wants to come out of the European Union but wants access to freedom of movement, from the local entrepreneur who wants to come out of the European Union but wants to remain in the single market, from the local grandmother who wants to come out of the European Union but wants the safety and security for her grandson, in terms of no wars in Western Europe that we've had for the last 43 years in the European Union. So these are challenges, and they're challenges that the political leadership of the country need to take on board. And the real issue is, what does being out of the European Union look like in a way in which it's for the interests of the people of the United Kingdom, and in my position, for the interests of the people of Scunthorpe area.
Well, this does raise quite a fundamental constitutional question about what being a representative means. And as we know, in constitutional theory in England, you're elected for your judgment, not as a delegate merely to reflect what you think the popular opinion is. That would be mere demagoguery. We have two issues current. One in the Supreme Court later this week. There'll be a decision about whether or not Parliament must have there should be an act of Parliament to trigger Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty and the process of coming out of the European Union. Also, last week's by-election in Richmond was won by the Liberals, who are standing very much on a pro-remain in, or at least have a second referendum. Now, that Member of Parliament, she has a very specific mandate to vote to stay in, not to trigger Article 50. Right. But she's the only one who stood in her present seat in this Parliament on that sort of grounds. So what's your responsibility as a representative? How will you be voting in the when the Supreme Court gives you the power, or insists that you vote on that statute?
Well, we don't know the outcome of the Supreme Court decision, but I think generally people expect the Supreme Court to uphold the decision of the High Court and Parliament's supremacy. And I personally, my own gut feeling is that's the right thing. We live in a parliamentary democracy, and this is about the relationship between Parliament and the executive. It happens to have got wrapped up into the Brexit thing, but that's not the fundamental issue. The fundamental issue is, who has the final say? Is it Parliament or is it the executive? And I think in a representative democracy, it's right if the answer comes out and says it's Parliament. So the big issue, the big question you should be asking, Hugh, is why on earth the Prime Minister doesn't just bring the Act to Parliament and get on with it. It's in her gift. I don't think that members of Parliament like myself are going to vote in majority against the triggering of Article 50. So once she brings it forward, it will go on. And I'll tell you why she hasn't brought it forward, because she doesn't yet know what she's doing.
I'm not here to to defend the Prime Minister, but I just want to get that principal point, that if the Parliament is a representative democracy, a lot of people are saying, well, of course, that's what the Brexiters was campaigning for, give us back our sovereign Parliament, and that there is a paradox when they say that Parliament then should not have the power to make this decision. But Parliament's authority is legitimate only because it is democratic.
That's right.
And and knowing what the democratic decision of the nation has been by a direct democratic process in the referendum, Parliament would lose any legitimate authority if it were to vote against what it knows to be the democratic will, would it not?
Well, Parliament has the legitimate authority. We were elected, MPs were elected in 2015 to represent their constituents, and that's what MPs have an obligation to carry on doing. You know, in the end, there will be an election in 2020 where MPs go back to their constituents and constituents say, yes, please, or no, thank you. And that's how democracy works. In the meantime, there are lots of pressures in terms of the people lobbying MPs and others about, you know, what they think things should be. The big question around Brexit is not whether we're leaving the European Union or not. I think that's a fairly clear direction of travel given to Parliament and government by the British people. However, leaving the European Union, we have no idea what that will look like and what the best relationship with the 27 remaining countries of the European Union will be for the UK. And it's more complicated than that, because this is not just about the relationship between the UK and the remaining 27 of the European Union. It's about the relationship between the UK and the rest of the world. For the last 43 years, that relationship has been forged within us being part of the club of the European Union. Now, there are some opportunities of being outside of that situation, but there are also a large number of challenges. Because if you're in a, you know, if you pay to be in a golf club, and the person outside the golf club, it comes back to you and says, I want to play on those greens. You probably will let that person play, but you're not going to give them a better deal than the rest members of the club. Neither, if your club has negotiated a particularly good deal with other people, other organisations, is that person going to get as good a deal as your club has got? So those are the problems that we face. Well, massive challenges.
We know nothing for another 2 years anyway, or so, what the consequences are. So we can only speculate, Nick, yes. Which is why I'm going to move on to something where we can talk a little bit more, well, with almost equal mystery, which is the internal politics of the Labour Party. The membership of the Labour Party massively recently expanded, with many people entering it have re-elected Jeremy Corbyn to the leadership, and I don't know how you get on with him, but most of his members of Parliament, the people elected on behalf of the Labour Party by the people, outside and in the Labour Party, can't stand the man. You're in an impossible position, aren't you?
It's a difficult position, but the reality is we had an election during the summer, and that election ended up with Jeremy Corbyn being confirmed as leader. It's our responsibility and our duty then to get behind that leader and do everything we can as part of the team. This is not, you know, it's not a single people issue. This is a team effort as part of the team to take Labour's message to the country. And also,
well, what is that message, though, Nick? Because your message is one that would be perfectly acceptable to Ed Miliband, whose leadership you ran under when you were last elected to Parliament, and that's quite a different message to that delivered by Jeremy Corbyn. Your colleague Melanie Orne in that chair a few weeks ago, a Member of Parliament for Scunthorpe, for Grimsby and Labour, suggested, implied, I think maybe even explicitly stated, that Jeremy Corbyn's a Marxist. Are you happy to support the election of a Marxist regime?
Well, look, I didn't vote for Jeremy. It's on the record that I didn't vote for Jeremy. I campaigned for Jeremy not to be the leader, but the reality is Jeremy is now the leader. I have a duty to get behind Jeremy.
Is he a Marxist?
I don't believe he is a Marxist, actually. I think he's an old-fashioned conservative socialist, and I think that's where he is.
That's a portmanteau phrase, old-fashioned conservative
well,
socialist.
that's what I think.
The 1970s Tony Bennite socialist.
I think the time when he was probably most comfortable was in the 1970s and 1980s. However, he is our leader. He's done very well at the last two Prime Minister's questions in pushing the Prime Minister on the issues of the crisis we've got in adult social care and the crisis we've got in health care. And frankly, the Prime Minister hadn't got the answers. And that's what we need our Leader of the Opposition to do, the Leader of Her Majesty's Opposition. This is an important job in terms of getting better governance and better decisions by our government. And Jeremy Corbyn has been doing that job really well since the summer when he was re-elected. But my duty is to get behind him and help him continue to do that job as well as possible.
But the Leader of the Opposition isn't only the chief scrutineer of the government, and quite rightly so, but he's also, or she, in this case he, is also the alternative Prime Minister. Is that an attractive alternative? And if it's an attractive alternative to you, because you'll follow your leader, as you say, do you think it's a sufficiently attractive alternative to the rest of the country that he's got a chance of getting the job?
Absolutely. I mean, people were saying only a few months ago that it was absurd to have a President Trump. We now know there is going to be a President Trump.
So we need to be as happy with the Prime Minister Corbyn as we are overjoyed by
the reality
President
is
Trump.
media folk like yourself, Hugh, were mocking the idea of there being Donald Trump in the White House. Media folk like yourself are now mocking the idea of Jeremy Corbyn being in number 10. You can be wrong once, you can be wrong once, you can be wrong twice.
Thank you very much. I'm no doubt I'll be wrong many more times than that. Do you see Jeremy Corbyn leading the Labour Party into the next general election? And very quickly,
Well, I think he's the leader at the moment. There is no election of leader in the offing, so my expectation is he will.
OK, Nick Dakin, thank you very much for coming in. I think
Thank
that's
you.
a very good point to stop, a little sooner than I expected, and but very satisfyingly definite. Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Nick. Thanks very much. That's all we have for Hot Topic this time. Please join me again for the next one.